I'm Jeet Heer. This is Blogging Heads, and I'm with Katherine. Katherine, do you want to introduce yourself?
I will. I am Katherine Mangu-Ward. I am the managing editor of Reason magazine, and Jeet and I are going to talk about why ladies don't love Rand Paul and or why there aren't very many lady libertarians. Jeet, since your piece started the whole conversation, why don't you talk about actually was it just the poll showing Rand Paul's performance with women being so low that got you interested, or is this something you had been thinking about before?
Oh, okay, sure. So I should say the impetus for the conversation is an article I wrote for the New Republic, and I should also add I'm a senior editor at the New Republic. But the article is about Rand Paul, who's running for the Republican presidential nomination, and he's having some polling trouble with female voters within the Republican Party. And that was the original impetus for the article. I think Ed Kilgore actually had called attention to this polling in a column in the Washington Monthly, and I was sort of very intrigued by it because it's very striking. Because if you look at just male voters in the Republican Party, Rand Paul is actually doing very well. He's like at 13%, but it's a crowded field, and he's like neck and neck with the other frontrunners. He's like at the same level as Scott Walker, and he's ahead of Jeb Bush. Unfortunately for Rand Paul, women have the vote, and so among female voters, he's at 2%, which I mean, and these are very small numbers. So there's a big margin of error, but it's still the case that that's a much wider gender gap than among any of the other Republicans, and it's a gender gap of 6.5 to 1. So that that got me thinking about why that might be, and it's sort of in alignment with some other polling, not about Rand Paul, but about libertarianism in general, which tends to show a less striking but still very strong gender gap of 2 to 1. That's by some polling, self-identified libertarians, 68% are men, 32% are female. And so I thought it might be a good occasion to talk about both Rand Paul and this larger phenomena. And in the course of my article, I interviewed various libertarians, including you, to get what they had, and then I offered my theory. So maybe this is a good way to open up the conversation. I mean, do we agree? Can we agree that there is something going on with gender and libertarianism? And then, what's your analysis of this?
Right. So it is. I think you would be hard pressed to find someone who could plausibly deny the sausage fest that is libertarianism. I mean, it's anecdotally true in Washington D.C. If you go to a libertarian happy hour, if you work for a libertarian magazine, just hypothetically, then you will be in a relatively male-heavy environment, and as you mentioned, polls bear that out as well. But just from the get-go, I would say. Primarily anecdotally, although there actually is a little bit of support for this in some polling that I've seen, there does seem to be a shift in the direction of closing that gap. And I'm saying that both from the perspective of kind of the difference between who you would have seen at, say, a Rand Paul at a Ron Paul event, in the last couple of cycles, because those crowds were disproportionately young, I think you were more likely to see that trend in action, and those crowds did have more women in them than you would have seen, historically at kind of libertarian-focused events. Also, Reason's applicant pool for interns, for instance, even in the time that I've been with Reason, has shifted to be a much higher percentage of women. So there's that. But yes, libertarians are still mostly men.
I think it's hard to get hard statistical data about the shift, but I would acknowledge that there has been something, because if you just look at photographs of a Libertarian Party convention from the 70s, as against, like a libertarian event now. Like I think my sense in the 70s is that, it would be upwards 90% male, right?
Well, the old joke was that you used to be able to hold Libertarian Party conventions in some guy's studio apartment. So there's also just kind of
it's much smaller.
It's a raw numbers situation. But yeah, I mean, the sort of, and we can talk about this, I think, a little bit more because you do mention it in your piece. But, there's sort of American libertarianism, using that term explicitly. And that really it's a relatively recent movement. It dates back to the kind of late 60s, early 70s, and that's also the same time as the birth of the Libertarian Party as an explicit organization. Many, if not most, libertarians would say that the kind of ideological impulse goes back much, much further and trace the roots to classical liberalism. But in terms of sort of getting demographics about Americans who called themselves libertarians or thought of themselves using that term, we actually don't have a very deep well to go to. It is only a few decades old. But yes, those first Libertarian Party conventions are like a bunch of dudes in their undershirts.
That's right, yeah. And in fact, I mean, if you don't mind, it might be useful, because I think not everybody here will be deeply versed in the history of libertarianism. So I want to maybe just very quickly sketch out a general thing, and then which is pertinent to this gender discussion as well. But as you say, there's a claim by libertarianism that it has roots in classical liberalism of like Locke and John Stuart Mill. I kind of don't really buy that, but it's okay. I mean, I think that's the generic heritage of Western secular thought in a way, right? But what you get starting in the sort of teens and 20s of the last century are people who are sort of individualists and who are sort of distrustful of the sort of progressive movement, and they tended to call them people like Albert J. Nock and H.L. Mencken. But they're just sort of disparate intellectuals, and they really sort of come together, coalesce into a more cohesive movement in the 1930s and 40s as a reaction to the New Deal. But at that point, they tended to call themselves individualists. I think that was the term of art at the time. And what's interesting about that moment of the 30s and 40s is, we were still dealing with a very small group of people, and among those small group of people, there's actually quite a few female thinkers who are really at the core. The most famous, say, would be Ayn Rand. I don't know if I never know if I'm pronouncing the name correctly.
That's right. It's Ayn like pine.
Yeah. So Ayn Rand, the famous novelist of The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, but also Isabella Patterson and Rose Wilder Lane. These were three women who, as one of your colleagues argues, were really had a he called them the three furies of libertarianism, but they really, in the early 40s, articulated a critique of the welfare state and of the New Deal, which was hugely influential, which really got people thinking. And then, as an outgrowth of Rand's own objectivist movement, starting in the 60s, you have people calling themselves libertarians and an organized libertarian movement. So that's the kind of genealogy. And I think, in terms of the gender question, this history, brings us certain important issues because, it's not the case that libertarianism is inherently hostile to women, right? There have been these very, very important female leaders right from the start. And I would also argue, unlike other, political formations that are sometimes associated with the political right, you don't really see anything theoretically patriarchal about libertarianism, right? It's not sort of social conservatism, or even sort of militaristic nationalist conservatism, which do have a lot of inherent gender notions, which some modern women might reject. But I think so. It's interesting to think about why libertarianism became, as you said so eloquently, a sausage fest.
So I think there is. First of all, I just want to, while I am a little bit of a skeptic of the term mansplaining, I want us to pause and enjoy the fact that that you just explained the history of the libertarian movement to a person who works at a libertarian magazine. I would just sort of to go back.
I should clarify. I'm not explaining it to you because you know all this stuff very deeply, but I thought listeners to Bogging Heads.
And it's always good to have a potted history. I would actually challenge a little bit this idea that the emergence of libertarianism in the 20s and 30s and 40s is explicitly a response to the New Deal, although it's certainly that's a huge factor. It's just I think it implies that it's sort of more reactionary in a way that I would not. That's certainly not the only version of the narrative. And I think the other sort of variant on that theme is to just say there were a lot of things going on in global politics that were making people skeptical about collectivist enterprises of all kinds, and sort of really looking for an alternative to the nation as the fundamental unit, and even the family as a fundamental unit, and instead what you wind up is with these kind of individualists. So I would say the emphasis on the New Deal, while legitimate, you might have overstated a little bit. So yes, we do have this sort of historical presence of women in the kind of early formation of the thought, and in fact, until relatively recently, I would say a huge percentage of people who have sort of come to libertarianism through reading a book, which is like very, very common. And that is one thing that makes libertarianism unusual. Got here by reading Ayn Rand, got here by reading The Fountainhead or Atlas Shrugged. Other people, Hayek is another gateway drug. Now the kids these days, they come in via the Ron Paul. This is something that's like a huge shift. If you ask somebody in their 20s, why are you a libertarian? So many people will say Ron Paul, or kind of the liberty movement that's sprung up on college campuses, largely in response to and as a follow-on to his candidacy. So I do think that's a significant shift. But yes, libertarianism is precisely because it's so individual-oriented and not family-oriented and not state-oriented. There really is, I think this is another place where libertarians are kind of looking back and saying, equal rights for women, equal rights for racial minorities. Rather than see those through the lens of collectives or groups, libertarians just say well, yeah, obviously all individuals should be treated the same and individually under the law. And that's kind of the libertarian twist on those social movements, which really shaped the 20th century.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And in some ways, it might, again, kind of takes us back to the sort of question, which I don't want to hark back on too much, but why libertarianism has tended to, slant male, because I actually think that there's a lot of aspects of that message that would resonate with women, and then also, tangentially, but not really tangentially. Libertarianism also tends to skew heavily white, and again, there's a lot of parts of the libertarian message that should be appealing to more people than it does appeal to. And in terms of the message you're saying, the critique of the family is actually something that, a lot of feminists should be sympathetic to. And certainly someone like Rand, the novelist Rand, not the politician Rand, Ayn Rand, her, calls for complete reproductive freedom and for, women working, should resonate with a lot of women. So again,
although I will chime in here and say that I came to libertarianism through reading Ayn Rand. I think she still is sort of a great spokesperson for libertarianism in a lot of ways. She does not have an unmixed record from a sort of classical feminist point of view, not least because one of her more famous essays is about why a woman should never be president. Her books are famously full of, rape and sort of dubious sexual consent scenarios. There's definitely a lot in Rand to make feminists nervous, and I actually think partially because Rand has played such a huge role in the sort of aesthetics and the foundation of modern American libertarianism. That is one answer to the question, like, why is it that libertarianism sort of consistently fails to attract women? Well, maybe it's it's a path dependence thing. Like, Rand was a woman, but her pitch is not something that's going to be an easy sell with all women, particularly women who are coming from certain generations of feminism.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point. Although I do find, just this is anecdotal again, but I know a lot of women who aren't libertarians, but who are really into Rand and really got something out of her, precisely for the sort of critique of the family and this call for, because I think women are often burdened with social expectations of looking after everybody and of putting themselves second. So Rand's message of self-interest resonates with a lot of women and is very and it's actually very useful for them. Just anecdotally, I have a cousin who's like myself, East Indian, and she really found Rand useful as a way of thinking through about her need to break from family obligations. Samuel Delany, the science fiction novelist, mentioned that his sister, who's a doctor, African American doctor, she really found Rand useful for encouraging sort of individual initiative. So I feel like with Rand, I think she does actually have a lot of female readers, but so there's still a path dependency question. But a lot of those female readers are like my cousin or Samuel Delany's sister, where the message that they're getting is of self-empowerment. The message is not to join the Libertarian Party.
Right. So another sort of thread in libertarian, and again, I feel like what we're just kind of doing here is pulling on the different kind of loose threads to look and see what's going on, because to some extent, I don't have an answer to this question.
Sure,
I'm a woman who's a libertarian and who kind of likes Rand Paul. Join me, fellow ladies. I don't know what their problems are, but another kind of thing that's going on here, I think, is people who are sympathetic to libertarian ideas, who come across those ideas from a variety of sources. One of the big takeaways, one of the sort of places you can wind up when you start thinking about the kind of questions that libertarianism raises is it virtuous to participate in politics at all? And there's a really good case for just saying no, go build something, go sell something, go do something, go start a free love commune, whatever. Don't spend your time sort of trucking and bartering in the sort of commission of force and fraud against other people through the tools of politics. And so I think another answer that could be there is maybe there's some reason why women are more likely to heed that component of the libertarian message. Some reason why women are more likely to sort of take to heart, okay, I found my political philosophy, and what that political philosophy tells me is screw politics. And so I'm not going to go be an active Republican primary voter, right? Because it is worth noting that that's who we're talking about in this polling is not, is the general population kind of sympathetic to limited government and, personal freedom? It's, who says they're going to vote for this guy.
Yeah, well, I think that, but there's two elements, right? There's Rand Paul standing among Republicans, and I actually we should maybe talk a little bit about that, because I think the reason why Republican women don't like Rand Paul might be distinct from women in general, right? But I feel like Rand Paul faces two hurdles. First, he has to get Republican women on his side, and then if he is the presidential nominee, then there's the larger fact that the libertarian message skews male, right? Which is undeniable from the polling and from a lot of anecdotal evidence. So, but I do think there's a critique of my article, and I think it's a fair critique, that those two things are separate things, right? I think Republican women are a distinct portion of the population, and their reasons, in some ways, Paul suffers from, he gets it from both sides. The fact that he is
that's the lot of the libertarian, right? I mean, you can sort of always make friends. You could always be invited to the party, but then there's always going to be a moment where it's oh no, I'm really not a liberal. I'm really not a conservative. I really disagree with you about half of your thing. And actually, I do think like one kind of slice of this is last night I was at the Competitive Enterprise Institute's dinner, which is, it's a libertarian group. And Carly Fiorina was speaking there, and she gave her feminism talk, which was like an interesting choice for the crowd. And the stuff that she was saying, I think, was a very good sort of politically packaged Republican message to women. And she didn't focus on the kind of social conservative, kind of the typical pitch you hear for, where Republicans are just trying to get suburban moms to vote for them. It really was much more about, something that looked more like the kind of girl power feminism of later ages. And I think, for many reasons like that, coming from a woman who's been professionally successful in the private sector is very appealing. Rand Paul's version of that message is very muted. He is not going out of his way to make that case. And there's a question of kind of chicken egg, right? Like why bother if it's never going to pay off, which I think is one possibility, similar to the way the Republican Party has treated racial minorities in terms of how much to reach out to them. But of course, Rand Paul is, with varying degrees of success, reaching out to particularly American blacks and saying, the Republican Party has something to offer you. So he could do the same for women.
Yeah, which I actually very much appreciate, and I think that's the Republican Party and libertarianism has a kind of history with race that is somewhat checkered, but the fact that he is making an active outreach effort to try to show how his politics, and not in a sort of catering way, a pandering way, but actually to show how his specific approach to politics.
Right. And it's consistent with things that have kind of long been a part of both the Libertarian Party, the Libertarian wing of the Republican Party, and also, the stuff that, Reason Magazine was founded in 1968. And a lot of the stuff that we have been editorializing for and talking about for 50 years is suddenly weirdly mainstream, stuff that even 10 years ago people were saying, that's adorable, libertarians. It's nice that you're ideologically consistent, but stop smoking the crack. And it's the legalization of marijuana, attention to the kind of militarization of the police, gay marriage. There's sort of a bunch of things that have suddenly happened that were very, very fringy, were very outside the mainstream, that are now suddenly, they are the mainstream. And I think Republicans, and particularly libertarian Republicans, are struggling with how to capitalize on that, how to say, look, we were right all along. So mainstream voters, join us. And I think, I'm not sure that they're selling that message yet, but Rand is certainly trying a variant of that with saying, I've always said the war on drugs and the resulting imprisonment of young black men is a civil rights violation and a tragedy. That could be a thing that Republicans stand for, but it historically hasn't been.
No, it hasn't been. So, I think it's great that he's doing that, and we need Republicans who take stands against the surveillance state and take stands against the militarization of the police. That's actually very good for American politics, and even if it doesn't necessarily get him a lot of black votes, if it gets to a situation where the Republican Party is not seen as the automatic enemy of black people, that's actually a huge good thing, right?
Right.
And I want to say this because I think some people interpreted my essay as being a kind of a hatchet job, that I was sort of commissioned by Chris Hughes, to go after this Republican. And I'm putting my cards on the table. I'm a statist, right? I'm a social democrat. But I do think that there's some valuable things in the libertarian thinking, and I want to see aspects of Paul's politics flourish. So I didn't intend the piece to be look what a horrible sexist Paul is, right?
So I guess one question that I had about the piece is, at one point you said that maybe one reason that libertarian-leaning politicians have not been successful with women is because, while not explicitly sexist, they've not kind of gone out of their way to kind of do interest group politics or kind of look at the sort of collective concerns of women explicitly, or that they don't sort of truck in that. I guess I'm wondering, like, why do you think that critique doesn't apply? I mean, libertarians don't look at the collective concerns of any collective, right? At least in theory. And so, like, it's true, like, also unions don't like libertarians. But, you could say the same about, like, well, libertarians don't particularly go out of their way to, like, boost, the economic prospects of white men in Rust Belt states. But, the numbers are not so dramatic there.
Yeah, no, but I think that actually gets to kind of like another thing, because I think for women who are antitypic, who are distrustful of libertarianism, and turned off by the message, is exactly this notion that they think, like, well, they conceive of liberty as such that, like, if I have specific concerns as a woman, and there's a collective interest in women in trying to solve a political problem, libertarians will say, like, well, why are you thinking of yourself as a woman? Why not think of yourself as an individual, right? But I mean, I do think like women, and I think, like racial minorities, like the way they, like in a society that has historically been sexist and has historically been racist, people, who are have experienced sexism and experienced racism, like for them, the message that you have to see yourself as an individual is a very flat message. Like, it doesn't deal with the fact that there are actual problems that require collective solution, right? Like, I think...
I'm skeptical of that take, and here's why. First, I do think there is a strong tradition, both in feminism and in the sort of the tradition of civil rights activism for blacks, that there are always two threads running through those kinds of movements, and one is a much more individualistic and one is much more collective. I mean, that's something that you see. That's something that you certainly see in feminism, and also just in the kind of even up to the present day in the debate about, say, reparations. Right? Is this a collective problem or an individual problem? But I think the idea that what libertarians are skeptical of is not group identity. Libertarianism is a group identity. What we're skeptical of is the use of the power of the state to favor one group over the other. So to the extent that people are saying, like, we need the government to take things from men and give them to women, I think it's right to say, like, that's a bad way to think about politics. That's a corrupt way to think about politics. Now, that's different than saying we want the state to treat men and women equally. There's a sort of expanding of the pie scenario. But frankly, the way that American politics frequently works is that the sort of loudest voice in Washington gets to take money out of the pockets of everybody else. And for the most part, we can there is collective agreement in the abstract that that's bad when we think about stuff like corporate subsidies or anybody who has a sort of a powerful lobbying presence and gets special treatment. But I think it's it's not immediately obvious to me why it is that by saying women shouldn't get special treatment under the law, that's like not an appealing message, because I think you do hear that all the time from people who say, like, I just want a chance I want equal opportunity, I want a chance to prove myself. That is an appealing message, and politicians stump on that all the time, Republican politicians in particular, so that it's not as if that's without resonance.
Sure. But I think it really gets down to the nitty-gritty of politics. Well, there's two things there. One is, do we conceive of the barriers to opportunity as simply existing in the state, right? Do we think that, like, it's just like, well, I think there's a wide social consensus that, like, racial barriers and sexual barriers by the state would be a bad thing. Like, if you had laws, as you once did, barring African Americans from voting or from being in the same schools as whites, or you have active laws barring women from professions. Like, we could see that as a state sexism, state racism, that should be banned. But I think the way most people experience sexism and racism is that it's not just located in the state, it's located in wider society. And that to challenge these things, you do need, social policies. The state is not just an instrument of repression, that they can actually like help people to overcome these things, right?
And this is why I think it's quite fair that you described yourself at the beginning of our conversation as a statist, right? Because in that, liberals and conservatives have a great deal in common. Both want the state to nudge social mores and push the culture in the direction that they prefer. And I think the libertarian insight, and one that, like, frankly always baffles me that more people don't sort of hear it and get on our particular bandwagon, is like, why in God's name would you trust the state with that kind of power, or have any reason to believe that it would successfully wield that power? At the very least, because there are two factions, two sort of traditional American political factions, who want the state to do things that are often directly opposed to each other. I mean, there is this sort of, not to mention the long, dark history of the state actually using state power to impose restrictions on women, to impose restrictions on racial minorities. So I guess I just think like the record of the state and sort of states historically is not good on the question of, like, if you give a bunch of, frankly, old white dudes in Washington power, are they really going to like hit it just right and make life better for the people they're trying to help, or are they more likely to impose costs and with regulation and other sort of restrictions on free behavior?
Well, okay, no, I mean, I think that is a sort of critique that has a wide resonance, and has a wide resonance outside the libertarian movement. Like, I think that's something, if you ask people in America and in all over the world, really, you trust the government. So, like, a lot of people, there's like...
But that's right. You're like, everyone will say that, but then what they actually mean is like, well, as long as my people are in power, and as long as I have a reasonable expectation that my people will remain in power in the like mid to long term, let's do this thing. And it's like,
no,
why?
But let's sort of step back here, though, because I feel like if you... Well, I mean, part of this story, which I didn't get into in the article, but I think is related, is the relationship women have had to the welfare state, right? Like, and here I'm sort of like channeling the Harvard historian and social theorist Theda Skocpol, right, who has a book called Protecting Women and Soldiers, which she talks about how, the welfare state was created by female activists to a large degree, and this is even before women got the vote, that you had in the progressive era women, who had very specific, like, gender issues because of their role as family caretakers, and sort of working for, like, things like child labor laws, restrictions on work hours, family wage issues, and then also, like, things like nutrition, right? Like, in the 20s, even, under Calvin Coolidge, you had, like, policies to teach women and to make it accessible, like minimum nutritional standards, and all sorts of issues about, like, schooling as well. So there is this, like, tradition of women precisely because, like, in some ways it's tied to sort of historical sexism, but because of the role that they have in society, finding the state as an instrument that's useful. And then later on, when it comes to, like, issues of workplace stuff, like, like anti-discrimination laws, and affirmative action. So there is a kind of, like, history of women finding empowerment to the state. So they don't see this as necessarily, not all women see this as a dark story. So I think that's part of it. And the welfare state itself is kind of often gendered as female, right? Like, people talk about the nanny state, right? So there's a way in which the and then, like mommy government, right? Like, the people see the Democrats as the mommy party because they're Social Security, and the Republicans are the daddy party because they blow up countries.
Right. And I think the story that you're telling, right, is the story that obviously people sort of tend to accept, and that shows up in stuff like these Rand Paul poll numbers. I think, to my mind, that's why what this question is, this question of, like, where are the lady libertarians? It's fundamentally, it's like a question of, like, storytelling and marketing, not something sort of fundamental about the philosophy, because I can tell you a story of, sort of the welfare state or the regulatory state and women that's the exact opposite of that story, right? Like I can tell you, a long history of legal barriers that kept women out of many, many professions, up to and including still today, the barriers that keep women out of some roles in the armed forces. I can tell you the story of the early labor movement, which was, there were decisions that kept women's hours restricted in the name of like protecting their precious uteruses and this kind of thing. There is a sort of easily told alternative. There's certainly the story of tax reform, which is sort of and conservatives are on the wrong side of this one of the sort of an existing tax code that while not the kind of couverture arrangement of yore where women sort of disappeared legally into their husband's person, but certainly still like the sort of concept of the marriage penalty, the concept of the two-earner household being treated unfavorably, and even the history of schooling, which you can again tell a story about how public schools enabled women. You can also tell a story about how women as primary caregivers are sort of hemmed in by bad public schools and by bad hours at public schools, and so I think like your story has won so far for sure. Like more people buy your version than my version, but I think my version is at least plausible, and I think it's a failure on the part of libertarians that like we haven't sold it better. And
yeah, but I don't want to gloat because because it's not like I deny your version of the story. Like I actually think that all those things are absolutely true about state support of sexism and the I would add,
and even today, just to throw in one more, even today women are women-owned businesses face like incredible regulatory barriers, not least because they're often not given priority in legislative debates because of the sort of cultural discounting of women's trades like caregiving and hair braiding and whatever. I the story goes on. It's not just like, at one time people were less enlightened and the state was used for evil and now it's fine. That's, I think, not true.
Yeah, but I mean, that's precisely why this is like an interesting question to me. Like, it's like, well, because I do think that there is even though, I'm like Mr. Statist and the more regulations, the better. It's still curious to me, like, why, libertarianism doesn't make these inroads, because I do think that you do have something to sell, right?
Well, I would say, I think libertarianism is making inroads. And, Rand Paul's poll numbers aside, there is this sort of phenomenon I've described where ideas that were historically considered libertarian have become more mainstream. I think there's also an element of there's maybe a lagging self-descriptor. I think there are lots of people, and this sort of shows up in polls, the Cato Institute has a sort of cottage industry in trying to parse exactly where these humans are, but it shows up in Pew and Gallup polls as well. People don't really know what the word libertarian means. Even people who describe themselves as libertarians then say, I think the welfare state should be bigger. So, there's this sort of baseline, most people are pretty dumb and don't know what they're talking about point that should always be made everywhere. But then...
It's into ideological debate, right?
Right. Well, but, I'm willing to stand by the sort of 50% of the people are below average claim. But, the sort of these terms of art are not... and you see a lot of actually noise even in the terms liberal and conservative, which are, of course, much better understood. But if you sort of ask people more specific questions about, should your taxes be higher? Should your taxes be lower? Should government be bigger? Should government be smaller? Should people be free to smoke weed? You actually do get a picture of people who are more libertarian in terms of their, more people who are libertarian in terms of their policy portfolio that they would support. But that still really doesn't show up in elections because the Libertarian Party is essentially non-viable and because neither party has really taken it upon itself, maybe until this moment with Rand Paul, to even go out of its way to kind of cast its mantle over libertarians or try to pull them in. So I think, partisan politics, as always, is like a lagging indicator on whether or not libertarians are really winning in any area of this discussion.
Yeah, no, I know. I absolutely, I agree that there's a sort of, larger sort of what we could call a libertarian gestalt or libertarian, sensibility, which does extend far outside of, libertarian movement, and far outside of the Republican Party, and then but I mean, is this a political power problem for you? Because like to actually enact changes, you need to like elect people, and so this is I mean, but granting, as you properly mentioned before, there's whole strands of libertarianism that think you shouldn't even be bothering with electing people, and you should be figuring out ways to subvert the state on your own.
Right. Well, and there's two threads there, right? There's the kind of like burn it to the ground libertarians, but then there's, I think, actually the more common and more diffuse strand, which is just the sort of ignore politics as much as you can. And one of the glories of living in 21st century America, and you see this by our voter participation rate, is like you can ignore politics, and luckily, like not much will happen to you. And that's like a great thing about living today where we live, where I live, is that there is this kind of like, peace and prosperity, sort of very, very, very broadly understood, that allows people to ignore politics. And I think, the idea that that's good and is sort of praiseworthy to do is more common among libertarians. So it's certainly a barrier to electoral success.
Yeah, although, I mean, I wonder about that. Like, I do feel like there's a lot of like energy on the left that's like non-statist, like that would like try to, like if you want to push for things like feminism, like is more interested in like trying to like build the communities rather than do that. And it goes in waves as well. Like I'm not sure how different libertarians are that from people in general. Like I feel like there's a lot of people who have different politics who are like not engaged with the electoral process.
Sure, that's definitely true. But I think in the end, the question of like all things being equal is, should the state be a tool in your arsenal to achieve change X? Mm-hmm. Both liberals and conservatives are going to say yes to that question, and libertarians are much more likely to say no.
Yeah.
And therefore not look to the state or interact with the state to get their ends achieved.
Yeah. I think that's right. But to go back to like the Paul question, because I think that one aspect is also there has been a historical alliance between libertarians and the political right, but that's also fairly recent origins. And again, I mean, you might dispute my history of this, but I do see that as a legacy of the New Deal. That in America in the 30s and 40s, people of like the Knock and Albert J. Knock or H.L. Mencken disposition really moved it towards the aligning themselves with the Republican Party or being considering themselves on the right in a way that they didn't before.
Yeah. So I mean, I think the story that sort of the movement tells itself internally and is that there's this kind of there's Frank Meyer, right, who's at National Review in the middle of the 20th century, and he sort of hatches this idea of fusionism, and while certainly the New Deal plays a part in it, again, like I would say, look outward a little more, and that the moment when communism and socialism looked like a kind of civilizational threat to a lot of Americans, that was a moment when it made perfect sense for conservatives and libertarians to be in alliance, right? Like to say, like, we will sort out our differences later. Right now it's kind of collectivism versus individualism. It's communism versus capitalism, and like we're on the same side of those dichotomies. There's like a cottage industry in Washington and elsewhere in which you have a panel and you put one conservative and one libertarian on the panel and you say, can conservatives and libertarians still be friends in the post-Cold War era? Right? Like, I personally have been on dozens of those panels. I think I'm doing one at Cato in like a month. And there is this sense of a historic alliance. There's also a sense of the incredible fragility of that alliance. The sort of complaint by libertarians, which I think is completely justified, is Republicans never love libertarians more than on the cusp of an election in which the Republicans have been out of power, right? Because that's their sort of peak anti-state moment. That's their sort of peak moment of saying, like, we want the same things. Like, let's throw the bums out and it'll all be different once Republicans come into power. Libertarians are like, yeah, maybe this time it'll be, and then it's like Republicans get into power and immediately are just jerks like everyone else. So, I think, I think this idea of the alliance is totally real. It's totally a legitimate fact in the American political scene. I think it's probably not super deeply relevant on the kind of ideological level, like on the level of principle anymore. And one place that you're seeing that is this sort of, there is, I think, been an upsurge in left libertarianism, bleeding heart libertarianism, libertarians who want to sell their libertarianism as the best thing for the least well-off, which I do think is right. And that has not historically been the emphasis of libertarians in America. But maybe it should be going forward.
Yeah, but so I really, and we're getting near the end of it, but I really want to pick on this one point because I feel like this alliance with the Republican Party, doesn't come without cost, right? Like, so, like Rand Paul and his father as well, as Republicans, they basically have to be anti-choice, right? They have to, if you're going to be running as a presidential candidate in the Republican Party, that's a pretty solid litmus test. Like, you cannot, be in favor of reproductive freedom. And that is an issue which, and Republican women would be on board with that, but like women in general, not necessarily the case. And especially, like, I would think a lot of the sort of, libertarian leaning women who are like, have their own business, are into girl power, would like admire a female CEO who runs a big computer company, they're not going to be super crazy about, like, being in a party that wants to outlaw abortion. Like, So I feel like that's a huge kind of like stumbling block. Like, if you're having an alliance between libertarians and conservatives, then and like for women, the price of that alliance is like, I'll get my low taxes, but then I have to give up, like one of a really fundamental freedom that affects me as a woman.
So I think, one thing that we're seeing in this election cycle, and like I'm definitely going to, Reason has been saying this for a little while, and like I will absolutely plant my flag in this, is a kind of fair weather federalism by Republicans, right? And so what's happening is there's lots of places where Republicans are realizing that they're losing the culture war, right? And this is gay marriage and drugs and abortion to some extent, and
like abortion, but
not so well, but they sort of had that realization a while back. So that's kind of an older one, but was certainly with gay marriage and drug legalization now. And what Republicans have sort of the tactical retreat that Republicans are taking is, it should be up to the states, right? Because what they think is like, listen, they could win some states, right? Whereas if it happens on the federal level, they're much more likely to kind of lose the whole enchilada. And I think that's yet another place where it's like libertarians tend to be, although are not universally, a sort of long-standing proponents of devolution of power and federalism and localism, and to see that language being used in the service of essentially like building little conservative fortresses rather than a kind of experiment, laboratories of democracy way, which libertarians tend to use it, I think is a little alarming, but also from a sort of purely pragmatic political place, maybe does open up some space for these women that you're describing, to say, listen, I disagree with, Rand Paul's position on abortion, but he also says, X, Y, and Z should be left up to the states. And in his case, he's very pro-life, just as his father was. I guess I should throw in here also, there are pro-life libertarians.
Sure,
That's the thing.
Yeah.
That's a real thread in libertarianism. But I'm not one of them for the same reason that I described earlier, which is like the state is bad at all the things, and it's going to be bad at figuring out this really difficult ethical question.
Sure.
But yeah, so I think that the federalism dodge is one thing that's happening that may open up some space for some people, depending on how that kind of hits their ear and their sensibilities. At the same time, it's not as if all women are pro-choice. Like the polling on this is very confused in a lot of ways, but a lot of women, even people who might otherwise describe themselves as fiscal conservatives and otherwise libertarian, do say that they think abortion should be illegal. So I'm not sure that's the stereotype of a woman that you created. I like her. I wish she was the whole electorate, but I'm not sure she is.
No. Women, I mean, the polling is like, men and women track similar on abortion, but I'm just thinking about libertarianism is kind of like a sensibility, and it tends to appeal to a certain type of, person who's like, they skews younger, skews more urban, skews, more cosmopolitan, and that type of person is, is less likely, not impossible, but less likely to be pro-life. So I feel like there's a tension, right? Like, and I think this speaks to like a larger point, because we're talking about historical narrative, right? Like for like women, if you're looking, and then for other groups as well, if you're looking back at the history of freedom, then like where were the libertarians, right? Like were the libertarians at the forefront of fighting for like reproductive freedom for women? Before Roe v. Wade, where was Hayek at the Stonewall?
I mean, a lot of libertarians were. If you look back in Reason magazine, there's certainly a thread of supporting that kind of like libertarian individual choice element in modern American politics. And it's sometimes hard to tell precisely because of this thing we were just talking about, where libertarianism is kind of subsumed in and muddled up with conservatism.
Exactly right. Like if the alliance has always been with the Republican Party, then like at key moments in the history of freedom, the libertarians were allied with people on the opposite side, right? Like I was about to say, individual libertarians could be pro-choice, but they're allied with a party that is anti-choice. Individual libertarians could be for gay rights, but they're allied with a party that is like anti-gay rights. Individual libertarians.
Well, and in fact, all those individual libertarians that you're describing tend to be the ones who aren't allied with that party, right? They tend to be people who are reluctant to use both the word libertarian and the word right-winger or Republican, precisely because of this problem, this cultural problem. And I think this is something that Republicans are seeing generally in younger people, that they are hesitant to be allied with the party that they see as historically having been on the wrong side of those questions. But frankly, I mean, if we're looking at a sort of electoral future in which libertarians find a home on the left, like Democrats are going to need to show a little more, like even a little more bad faith, right? Like the Republican sort of olive branch to the libertarians, which comes every 4 to 8 years, like it's kind of bullshit, but at least they say words that sound pretty good. And the modern Democratic Party is, has lagged, honestly, almost as badly as Republicans on many of those issues. I mean, I remember the Democratic primary debate 2 cycles ago where everyone on the stage said marriage is between a man and a woman. So it's not as if Democrats have sort of consistently held these principled stakes that were appealing to libertarians, and we just kind of were like, let's go Republican. It was like, they weren't giving us much to work with. So I would be happy to see that change, but it's not, right now we've got Hillary Clinton and Bernie Sanders, who neither of whom are exactly libertarian poster children.
No. But it is the case. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And it's something that people kind of tend to forget. But I mean, on sort of like, criminal justice reform, like the incarceration stays, the Democrats were as bad as the Republicans. And on the militarism, I mean, I don't hold any keys. But I think on the social liberalism question, but that's also fairly recent, but it did start in the 60s. Starting in the 1960s, you definitely saw the Democrats being more socially liberal, and it's like really widened since then. And the Democrats are the home of social libertarianism.
It's true, but it's also often packaged with a sort of statist enforcement of those more socially liberal values, and that's something that I think, as you said, we're almost out of time. But this idea that at the same time you can say women should have more choices and have more control over their own bodies and their professional lives and their finances, but if you are at the same time saying we have to put a bunch of laws in place that restrict behavior that people would like, contracts that people would like to make that they're not allowed to make or things that they're not allowed to say, and we're seeing this on college campuses right now. There's this sort of a big question of free speech and due process that's heavily gendered. I think, again, there's sort of socially liberal in the sort of appealing, let's throw open the doors libertarian way, but for libertarians, the Democratic Party is often pairing that with some sort of, heavy-handed government action to enforce the sort of equality they want to see.
Sure. I think that does come down to the nub of the difference, not just between us, but between women who might be sympathetic to libertarianism but don't join, which is this very question: like, can the state be used as a force for empowerment? And I mean, the only thing I would say is, like, if you look at history, like, women in the sort of more socially democratic world of today, as against 50 or 100 years ago, are much more liberated, right? Like, it's just not. So it doesn't seem like, and then like, lots of other people are more have more freedom. Like, I feel like if you're a woman or if you're black or if you're gay, you have much more liberty than you would have like a century ago. So the narrative that
compared with a century ago, so there's this sort of tension in libertarianism, right? Which is, there's this sort of tendency to focus on bad news. Oh, it's a new regulation, it's a new power, it's a new war, or whatever it is. But I actually think, the sort of story of modern political history is actually a story of the state shrinking, right? I mean, it's the story of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, and saying, governments are limited, and that the fundamental rights reside with the individual. And I think that's a very libertarian idea. And to sort of say everything's gotten better and people are freer is totally true. Where you sort of pin causally the growth or shrinking of the state in there, I guess we're back to this sort of, you can tell a version of the story, but I would say, there's another version of the story, which is that every time the state backs up, things get better, not just for, old white men, but for women and people of color as well. So
I think that's right. But I mean, it seems like and something I mentioned in the article, but the traditional libertarian narrative is a narrative of decline, right? It's the road to serfdom.
I absolutely push back on that. I think the traditional libertarian narrative in the mid-20th century was one of decline, because do you remember the mid-20th century? Everyone's narrative was a narrative of decline. Things looked really bad for a minute there, particularly in the wake of the Second World War. If you read Reason magazine, you will actually see this incredibly strong, and I think, always existing thread of futurism, of optimism about what markets can produce and how the things that markets can produce help everybody. I think the idea that sort of products that are created as luxury goods for rich people that become, in no time at all, the staples for everyone. That's a very libertarian idea, this sort of idea of like cornucopianism and plenty and progress in that arena. I think is very optimistic compared to the sort of progressive or liberal narrative of like, there's a fixed pie and we just need to redistribute the pieces.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Although, okay, no, I think that's a good note to end on.
All right. It was very cheerful, so we'll leave it there with the cheering.
Yeah.
It was a real pleasure talking with you, and let's do this again sometime.
Thank you. I really enjoyed it.